Hi, I'm Mitchell Kopitch, and tonight I'll be doing a full breakdown of the bosses in Dark Souls, as well as going over my revision to the Gold Standard Run, a self-imposed challenge run I recently did of the game. Now, I had practiced doing Let's Plays on multiple games before I attempted Dark Souls, but I ran into an unexpected snag this time around. I couldn't concentrate, I couldn't document my strategies or my thinking on the bosses, and be speaking out loud at the same time. Since quantifying the difficulty of the bosses was my first agenda, I decided to scrap the Let's Play as it became a detriment to that process. In the future, I would like to try a Let's Play again, but I'll have to have less stakes as I don't normally talk while I play, so it's just something I'll be putting on the back burner for now. But I did promise an evaluation of the bosses, so I'll be covering that in this video. And then I'll also go over some of the rule revisions I'm making to the challenge run I made, so you can do it yourself if you'd like. Alright, let's get into it. First, we'll talk about boss theory and the statistics I'm using to quantify them, and then I'll give each boss scores relating to difficulty, cheapness, and exploitability. And I might give a word or two for some of them as well. The reason I'm not going to talk about them in depth is I think the statistical information will speak for itself, and so much has been said about them already. But I do have some thoughts with regards to the aesthetics of a couple of the bosses. You can find this material in my intimate look at Dark Souls, which is on my channel as well. After we score the bosses, I'll talk about the run and the changes I'm making to it. Before we score each boss, however, I think it'd be worthwhile to go over a few ideas with regards to boss theory, so let's do that now. There are many different factors to consider when quantifying the experience of a boss battle. Bosses are given special significance in Dark Souls, even more so than many other games, and we could cite any number of things to prove this. The inclusion of music, the elaborate, often unique designs, boss soul items and weapons, bosses that drop keys to new areas, bosses that progress the plot, bosses that test mechanics, I could go on. But what sometimes gets lost along the way is what content is evaluated and why. And so I'm going to take this time to elaborate on game design of a boss encounter, but we should also consider other more obtuse elements, like aesthetics or narrative interests. So first thing on the agenda is to go over a list of attributes I find most relevant to my breakdown, so you know why I'm giving each of the bosses the score I think they deserve, and then we'll talk a little bit about them. We can start by addressing this question: what makes an enjoyable boss battle? As I give my answer in a series of traits on sliding scales, do consider that I don't think doing any of these things one way versus the other makes or breaks a boss, only that it communicates different effects for the player. So, for instance, the first item on my list is challenge. This spectrum would include easy bosses on one end and difficult or hard bosses on the other. The Souls series is known for being quite difficult, and the bosses are a large contribution to that, so I'd say it's fairest to want the majority of boss battles to be in the medium to hard range of things. In another game, other factors might take priority. 3 Zelda bosses, for example, are more about solving a puzzle and serving a theatrical send-off than surviving in combat, the latter of which may be absent of difficulty. But the point is, bosses offer some sort of challenge, and with the Souls series you can never expect what is being challenged, be it your wit, instincts, resolve, patience, or your very expectations. For the most part, though, challenge is concerned with mechanical challenge, and we'll get into the other stuff later on. The second item would be length. The range of this would obviously be boss fights that are short and boss fights that are long. This is a subject I don't think is mentioned often enough. People usually say simply that a boss they expected to be difficult was defeated in a timely fashion, and that this means the boss was easy. But if this is the type of boss where the smallest number of errors would mean failure, then I think it's jumping the gun by calling it easy. For myself, I much rather prefer longer fights as a general rule of thumb. It helps them stay with me when I rethink the experience. The next would be boss moveset. A boss can either have a simplistic or complicated moveset, and both have their merits, but I think the middle to more dynamic tends to be more fulfilling. And while many Souls bosses are in that range, there are plenty of enjoyable bosses that utilize a more limited moveset. Then you have the stage design, again simplistic or dynamic, and for this one it is hugely dependent on the boss itself. For instance, I am far more forgiving of recycling boss fights, assuming the fight brings something new to the table, and a different, more complicated arena is a good way to accomplish this. Then you have phases or unpredictability, and this includes things like a straightforward fight versus one where the boss has multiple phases. This is basically the same as moveset, but I separate it because sometimes a boss becomes 2 completely different fights altogether, just happening one immediately following the other. Then we have teaching versus testing, the idea being, is the boss being controlled heavily by the developers in order to teach the player something, or is the AI largely left to its own devices as a test for the player to prove they are mastering the expectations of the game? I could talk about this in more depth, but for our purposes here, I'll just say that I strongly prefer bosses that lean towards testing. Some minor teaching is fine, like the plunging attack against the Asylum Demon, but the issue is that on subsequent playthroughs, we will already know about whatever it was the boss was teaching us, and it turns them into a formality or a chore. If, however, it's more about testing the player, well then it's up to the player to hone their skills once again. If you want to get the player warmed up, you can put easy to medium level bosses up front. And this is basically the principle you can find in many platformers. Earlier areas are not tutorials, but they are easy, so it gives new players a chance to gather their bearings, and veterans a warm-up. In general, teaching is basically telling the player what to do, and testing is allowing them to just do it. Like the age-old show don't tell, you need a little bit of both, but one is more engaging than the other. And lastly, we have the thematic undertones, or implications, the narrative and lore that allows the encounter to exist at all. This one is less of a sliding scale and more about how the boss should be interpreted by the player. The theatrics of a boss might override all other concerns, turning the sequence into something more akin to a QuickTime event or cinematic. This is fine, but if a boss is overly concerned with its theatrics, then quantifying things like challenge or enjoyment can become a bit of a superfluous effort on my part. So, what makes an enjoyable boss battle? Well, this list attempts to give you an image of values and numbers. We have challenge, length, moveset, stage design, phases or unpredictability, teaching versus testing, and the thematic undertones or implications. And so these are just things to keep in mind as I go through and give the scoring for each boss. Now, how I'm going to do this is I'm going to go over each of them in the order that I fought them for this most recent playthrough. They will each receive a difficulty ranking, a cheapness ranking, an exploitable ranking, and an overall satisfaction ranking, which will be my personal sentiment of them. Let's kick things off with the good old Asylum Demon. The Asylum Demon. Difficulty, easy, cheap, no, exploitable, no. Rank, he's serviceable. He's a tutorial boss, not much else to say. The Taurus Demon. Difficulty, medium. Cheap, no, exploitable, yes. Rank, good. The reason this boss is exploitable is you can climb up the ladder and do a plunging attack, and you can just do this repeatedly until he dies. But this is also a pretty easy thing to avoid as well, so it's not that much of a hindrance. You can fight him on the bridge, or you can do what I did and fight him on top of the tower here. And oddly enough, fighting him on the bridge I think is easier because you have more distance to get away. The Moonlight Butterfly. Difficulty, medium. Cheap, no. Exploitable, no. Rank, good. The Bell Gargoyles. Difficulty, easy to hard. Cheap, no. Exploitable, kind of. Rank, serviceable. The gimmick of this fight is that unless you're a veteran player, you absolutely must implement some external source in order to prevail. You have to summon Solaire, use a resin, upgrade your equipment. You can't just go in with your skills, you must make an offering to the game to show that you are knowledgeable of at least one element of its mechanics. Overall, this fight is only serviceable. Its emphasis on teaching the player about upgrades and summons is important, but taken to such an extreme that not doing these things makes the fight exaggeratingly difficult or tedious, and doing them makes the fight completely trivial. Better, I think, if the fight was simply hard, and then you have to use a resin or upgrade to make the fight simply fair. But what tends to happen is you accidentally make the fight too easy on yourself without intending to. Maybe there's a sweet spot of a +3 weapon or something, but if I have the materials to make my weapon stronger than that, there's no reason to think that the player won't do so. Capra Demon. Difficulty, medium. Cheap, yes. Exploitable, no. Rank, good. That might be surprising to some people, but he's one of my favorite bosses in the game. And if you want to know more about it, you can check out my intimate look on my channel. I give a full breakdown of the aesthetics and the design of it, so if you're curious to hear more, you can check it out on my channel there. The Gaping Mouth Dragon. Difficulty, easy to medium. Cheap, no. Exploitable, no. Rank, good. I know he's not a particularly hard boss, but the aesthetics really carry this one, and he's another one of my favorites that you can find in my intimate look as well. And that's the last time I'll do that since I only have 3 favorites, and the other one would be the Moonlight Butterfly, so a little bit of a spoiler or a tease for that one. Let's move on. So, Quelaag. Difficulty, medium. Cheap, no. Exploitable, kind of. Rank, good. Apparently there are a couple of exploits, but they seemed pretty difficult to pull off to me. The first is to shoot the human part of her with an arrow that'll stun her, but this is really only a benefit in co-op. If you're by yourself, having her stunned only lasts long enough to stun her again, which isn't very useful. I suppose you could take her down exclusively with arrows at that point, but I've yet to see anyone do this in an efficient manner. She's not hard enough to warrant that kind of effort either. Ceaseless Discharge. Difficulty, not applicable. Cheap, yes. Exploitable, yes. Overall score, bad. I tried very hard to give this boss an honest fight, but it just wouldn't happen. The first round went reasonably fine, but if you die, you end up locked into having to battle him in the most uninteresting fight you'll ever have. What's worse is that even my initial attempt was virtually the same thing. Dodge, attack, wait for him to drop his arm, and do the same thing all over again. Look, here I am trying to get back my souls. What an asshole. I'm well aware of the exploit for this boss, running back to the beginning of the stage and getting his arm stuck. And you know what, that's how I'm going to fight this boss for all future playthroughs, because he's not worth fighting otherwise. I appreciate his contribution to the lore, but the gameplay leaves a lot to be desired. I mean, look at this. If I can't get a standard match out of a boss with minimal to average effort on my part, then they lose a lot of value for me. I shouldn't feel like I have to perfectly position a variety of things just to get a decent fight, because most bosses provide this anyways. It's also unnecessarily long to deal with him this way. But as a troll boss, I can see why making him more dynamically interesting would defeat the gag. Stray Demon. Difficulty, medium. Cheap, maybe. Exploitable, kind of. Rank, serviceable. So I don't mind having 3 fights essentially copy and pasted. The first round with the Asylum Demon is pretty weak. I mean, he's a tutorial boss. Personally, I very much enjoyed the fact that we had another fight with him because it meant 2 things. Firstly, I get to have a real fight with him since the first one is heavily simplified since the player is a novice, but I also like the fact that there are multiples of this type of demon walking around. Like Capra and the Taurus Demon, I like that they exist as a part of the world. There's only one gaping mouth dragon, but there are many stray demons, and the mix of these works nicely. What I don't like is the actual fight itself. You're constantly baiting out one of like 3 different attacks, and only the butt slam really gives you a chance to retaliate. He favors his area of effect explosion just far too much. Perhaps this version should rely solely on his hammer. This way the Demon Fire Sage would have magic, making each version just that little bit different from one another. Pinwheel. Difficulty, easy. Cheap, no. Exploitable, yes. Rank, he's bad. Would you believe you can actually die fighting Pinwheel? Yeah, apparently if you take too long, he'll generate more versions of himself, and with so many on screen at once, they'll bombard you too fast for you to do anything. My death here means Pinwheel won, and me... Well, let me think, how many times have I played Dark Souls? It's been said to death, but this game is all about the undead, so I'll add to it. Pinwheel has no health. I label him as exploitable because unless you're dragging your feet like I was at first, he puts up next to no effort to defend himself. The fight has to actually happen if you're going to be able to assess anything. The Iron Golem. Difficulty, medium. Cheap, no. Exploitable, no. Rank, serviceable. Why is he breathing? I thought it was just a suit of armor. Crossbreed Priscilla. Difficulty, easy. Cheap, no. Exploitable, no. Rank, serviceable. Dark Sun Gwendolyn. Difficulty, hard. Cheap, no. Exploitable, no. Rank, good. Each move he has is a complement to the others, or a way to change things up. I like his design, moveset, and the stage. It's just difficult to feel like you're making progress since you sometimes get close enough to hit him only to do a tiny bit of damage, which can be pretty demoralizing. He is a harder version of the Moonlight Butterfly though, and I think that adds a lot to him since it's very likely you'll face him after the Butterfly. Where both bosses force you to dodge a series of projectiles, Moonlight Butterfly gives you a large, unmissable window to attack. Gwendolyn, by contrast, is much more strict about this, and he also makes you run into the face of his projectiles rather than just attempt to avoid them. Despite the simplicity of his moveset and the stage itself, it manages to be a pretty unique boss all the same. Ornstein and Smog. Difficulty, hard. Cheap, yes. Exploitable, no. Rank, serviceable. Now, here's a fight that needs no introduction, but I also don't have too much to say about it either, other than that it took me 25 attempts in total, which is at least 15 more than the next hardest boss to get through, which coincidentally was Dark Sun Gwendolyn. This boss is hard in such a way that it doesn't feel very fair. In the future, I suspect I'll be summoning Solaire or another player to help me with this boss because it fits the theatrics better and it just really isn't worth fighting them solo, at least if you're a melee fighter. I ended up adjusting the rules to my run by adding another spell at this point, Great Heavy Soul Arrow, simply to speed things up, and once I did that, it only took 4 attempts. You might see that as cheating against my own rules, but most of the bosses I fought took about 1 to 5 attempts, so you could say 4 was a number I was looking for. By using just Soul Arrow like I was, it dragged out the fight much too long and left me open to death too many times. And it was the same thing going with melee. And that's in comparison with all the other bosses. I don't think it's sensible that a game requires one boss to have 25 attempts when every other boss in that same game is in the 1 to 5 range, or even 1 to 10. Obviously the player is meant to upgrade in some way, as was the case with the gargoyles. You could argue imbalance is the point, and there's certainly some sense to it, but it doesn't excite me to replay it, so I'll just let my bias speak for itself on that one. Sif. Difficulty, easy to medium. Cheap, no. Exploitable, no. Rank, good. The Four Kings. Difficulty, hard. Cheap, kind of. Exploitable, no. Rank, I have to say bad. Every time I start up a new game of Dark Souls, I always have to weigh the fact that I'll have to fight this boss again. In the past, it consistently took me hours, usually days, just to get past this one boss. He literally ranks as one of the hardest bosses I've ever had to deal with in any video game, and I've played a lot of games. Fortunately, on this new playthrough, I managed to beat him on my first go, so I feel much more confident about my objectivity with him now. I think why the Four Kings are so difficult for me is due to the random element. Depending on which move the Kings decide to use, the amount of time you spend in the fight can vary significantly, and time is your worst enemy here. If you watch the footage closely, you'll notice that I get lucky with the first 3 Kings, and it's only the last one that goes for the smarter tactic. As you watch the footage, all of the Kings relied quite heavily on their melee attacks, which makes me wonder if the AI had been changed at all in the remaster. If that's the case, I could call this a good fight, but regardless, I never feel like I get out of this fight because of skill, patience, endurance, or proper planning. Instead, it always feels like the result of luck, which isn't what draws me into these games. Because in every time I do defeat the Four Kings, it's always significantly easier than all of the other failures leading up to it. I'm only grinding my teeth in the matches I fail, but never in the rounds I'm victorious in. The other thing I don't like is that you pretty much have to be playing the game a very specific way in order to beat them. That being to get as close to them as possible and just attack, ignoring all the punishment you're receiving. The gargoyles might be incredibly easy, but at least you have many ways of overcoming the fight, and the Four Kings just don't seem anywhere near as conducive to different playstyles. But I suppose I can't really say that too much since many other bosses have a gimmick they want the player to overcome also. The Four Kings just isn't a very interesting request to make the player stand still and mash R1 the whole time. But if they decide to attack with something else that prompts the player to do something different as a response, then it eats away at the clock, making the fight more difficult. And it's not going to be because the player isn't playing well, it's going to be because the AI decided to perform a move that takes up substantially more time than others. Playing well is part of it though. It's because I have a high magic resistance shield that I can block the projectile and thus minimize how much time it would take up. It's because I know the fight is a DPS check that I can make sure to have a fully upgraded weapon and great magic weapon active. So, I don't know. Lastly is of course the extremely long walk. To be honest, I was really baffled to hear that there was a bonfire added next to Vamos, the blacksmith, but not a bonfire for New Londo? There is already a secret bonfire in reasonably close proximity to Vamos, but I guess because it wasn't warpable, they didn't count it? Still, unless there is some lore reason for why bonfires can't exist in New Londo, I really think there should have been at least one at the start of the stage. I know this would put it very close to Firelink, but it would save you the elevator trip, which is extremely long. One thing I can say is that the fight lasted about 3.5 minutes, for me this time, which is a bit shorter than I would like. But given the high pressure situation and the urgency of the musical score, I think it's better to be a bit on the shorter side for this one. Not every fight needs to be lengthy. So I don't know. This fight is just the bane of my existence. I got through it easy this time, but I feel like that won't be indicative of the future. Gravelord Nito. Difficulty, medium. Cheap, no. Exploitable, no. Rank, good. Seath the Scaleless. Difficulty, easy to medium. Cheap, no. Exploitable, yeah. Rank, bad. He's pretty easy overall, and completely exploitable if you just follow one of his left or right tails, since he'll spend the whole time trying to keep up. But even if you force yourself to pretend you aren't aware of this, he's pretty straightforward. As an interesting side note, his most lethal attack is when he slams his tail around, but this really only occurs if you're trying to cut the tail off. I do think it's ironic that his tail slam is his most powerful attack when it's entirely physical. It just goes to show that despite all his efforts to learn magic, he probably would have been better off just relying on his physical strength, since that's what he's best at anyways. It does make me wonder if Seath was a particularly weak dragon among his peers, and perhaps that became the fuel for a lot of resentment. Thus his betrayal of his kind and pursuit of magic, something other races wouldn't ridicule him for pursuing. Demon Fire Sage. Difficulty medium. Cheap no. Exploitable no. Rank good. Round 3 with this demon. This is by far my favorite version of the fight, as he's the only one that seems to have both a decent amount of health and a varied attack pattern. That said, he's cheapened a little bit since I always fight him last. Overall, he's the definitive version of the fight, even if the fight isn't particularly memorable. The Centipede Demon. Difficulty medium. Cheap no. Exploitable no. Rank serviceable. Bed of Chaos. Difficulty not applicable. Cheap yes. Exploitable no. Rank bad. Without a doubt, this is the worst boss of the entire game. In fact, it's so awful I sometimes wonder if the whole thing is a big joke. There are many, even small things, that could have made the fight more tolerable, but doing those things would make it only a bad boss. Because as it is now, it wears the worst boss badge with pride. No other boss makes you walk as far for another attempt. No other boss one-shots you like this one. No other boss cannot be locked on. No other boss is as cruel with your time as this one. Like most people, I appreciate the attempt to change things up, but this boss just goes much too far. The big issue isn't even that it's more of a puzzle or a gimmick than a straightforward fight. No, the real issue is in how cutthroat it is. It could have been solved with a nearby bonfire. It could have been solved if the crumbling forest just dropped the player onto another floor below, and then made them walk back to the start of the arena and climb up a ladder or walk up a tree route to get back on track. What happens instead is you end up falling to your death and having to make this absurd walk just to have another go. Whatever the case, it's a good thing you don't have to do it all in a single go, because the chances are good you'll die a few times. I ended up destroying both sides and then missing the drop down for the center on my first playthrough, so it only took me 2 tries in total on that one, which has never happened to me since. This most recent time took me 10 attempts, simply because it's so difficult to keep your footing. I think if you could roll over the arm swings, you'd have more of a chance. But that's 3 suggestions I've given that would have made this boss more doable, and I feel like that's more than it really deserves at this point. The design and the name of the boss are the only good things I can really grant it. Sanctuary Guardian. Difficulty hard. Cheap no. Exploitable no. Rank good. In fact, that's how it's going to be for Artorias, Manus, and Calamite as well. All of the DLC bosses are much harder than the others, they're not cheap, they're not exploitable, and they're all just solid fights all around. Gwyn. Difficulty medium to hard. Cheap no. Exploitable no. Rank good. Ah, Gwyn. Finally, I mastered the parry against you, trivializing this otherwise climactic send-off. Not like that. I did get the parry, though it wasn't nearly as useful as I've heard. I would have needed a great sword with crystal magic weapon or something to really waste Gwyn. As it was, he provides a good fight even if you do parry him. Naturally though, this encounter is all about the music. I remember being really perplexed to hear a somber piano theme for the end of this harrowing adventure. But that's what makes it special, right? So overall, there are a couple of rough patches, but the majority of bosses are rock solid, even if they're outside of the norm of expectations. If anything, that just makes them all the more interesting. Alright, so now let's go over some of the rule changes I'm going to be making to the gold standard run of Dark Souls. If you're not familiar with the rules already, you can check out my other video on the channel that goes over them, but for now I'm just going to give you the revision of what that looks like. Rule number 1, no helpful summons. Yep, this was a good rule to have, not changing it. In fact, if you haven't played Dark Souls without any summons, I highly suggest going through it at least once with no summons. It's very worthwhile. Rule number 2, about picking 5 set items and sticking with those, I ended up cutting because it didn't contribute enough to warrant anything special. Sometimes I just want access to a homeward bone, and quest items like the pendant shouldn't count as an item slot, and not being able to do simple things like that was just annoying. Now, one part I did like was in giving myself access to purging stones, so that meant I needed to be cursed in order to get through New Londo ruins. But you could just as easily veto Transient Curse if you wanted to do this. Transient Curse kind of trivializes this area anyways, I think, so I'm cutting this rule, but I'm replacing it with a new one. So the new rule number 2 is you may not utilize the Rite of Kindling. The logic I was going with was that it doesn't change things to have 5 or 20 flasks, because having more flasks just saves you more time from having to trek back to the bonfire. But I feel like this game is absolutely doable with 10 flasks, and in fact, it's kind of the implied difficulty setting the player can set for themselves. Plus, you'd have more instances harkening back to your first playthrough, on the edge of your chair, weighing how many flasks you have left with how much further you have to go. We may know all the bonfires now, but it could still be tense if we're low on healing. Now, I could make this rule no kindling entirely, but for myself at least, I'd also have to request to kill all the firekeepers so as not to have 10 flasks at any point. That might make for a good challenge run, but at the moment, I'm thinking 10 flasks is going to make for a good enough challenge. Rule number 3, where you get 3 level ups from each boss you defeat, that was a great rule, lots of fun. But one additional challenge you could add if you wanted is to make it so that you cannot level up a stat more than once for each boss. Basically, this would ensure things like health and stamina will consistently level up with the defense boost you already get. Now, if you want to take care of your OCD tendencies, you could also do what I did and include both Hydras and the Red Drake as bosses. Since I was a deprived, this put me at exactly level 90 when I went to fight Gwyn, which does my heart good. If you're any other starting class though, I say consider level 6 to be the default starting level, and just boost yourself to that point before administering the extra levels. And however you decide to distribute it, 3 levels after every boss was a pretty good number for me. The only downside is sometimes I would be a little short on souls to level up that much from one boss, so what I ended up doing is writing down how many soul items I needed to consume from upgrading, and then using that number later to make sure I could stay up on my leveling. Speaking of soul items, needing to use those for weapon and armor upgrades is a really fun condition. I'm going to make a change though. Rule number 4 for the upgrade equipment clause is still going to require soul items for upgrading your gear. The catch this time around though is that it gets more expensive depending on the size of the shard. So what I did before is you would just use a soul item every time you needed to level up a weapon or a piece of armor or something. This time, what it'll amount to is 1 soul item is worth any Titanite shards. But if you're going to use an upgrade that requires large shards or green shards, you'll need to consume 2 soul items. And similarly, for Chunks, Twinkling, Demon, and Dragon Titanite, you would need 3 soul items, and then you would need 4 soul items for slabs. Boss soul items, there's only 10, are worth 4 upgrades or 4 soul items, and the Soul of a Great Hero is the biggest soul item, and that'll count as 2 upgrades. And this is just there to kind of help balance things out. Because with this rule, you'll need about 30 soul items to max out a weapon, and around 20 for armor pieces. The rule was kind of broken the way I did it because I relied on a lot of Twinkling items, which needed much less soul items to consume because the upgrades were smaller. So that was just a change I made. I haven't tested this one out, and it's worth going through at least once to try it, but I think it'll work out for the best because the rule almost worked as I had it. It just needed some adjustment. The rule about being forced to stick with just 2 rings for the playthrough was, well, it didn't work out well. And I'm not sure if it was just because I went double tier stone, but didn't have the health or defense to really utilize those rings, or what. The 2 rings I really wanted to refrain from using was the Ring of Favor and Protection and Havel's Ring. And the main reason I was avoiding those is I wanted to be at medium weight capacity, but with medium to light armor. I didn't want heavy armor, but I wanted to have to deal with the medium roll. So I got that. In the future though, it's too annoying. But I do have a thought on what to do with it. So rule number 5 concerning loadout tiers. Giving myself the Silver Knight Straight Sword may be incredibly lethal, far more than I expected. So I revised the upgrade system for balancing. You can look at the description for some examples, but you by no means have to follow my outline. Basically what I did is lessen the number of upgrades. As it was, I was going to end up with a Black Knight sword, but gave it up since I was already overpowered. And I've changed some of the choices to be far less significant. So, just as an example, let's say you start out with the East-West shield. That means you can upgrade it to the Heater shield, and then eventually into Sanctus. The reason it's set up like this is it means you'll have 3 and no more than 3 different things to upgrade. And it also means that each one provides something substantial to upgrade. Like the East-West shield doesn't block 100% of physical damage, the Heater shield will, And then if you want to go into Sanctus, that would work because you'd get the passive healing effect that it comes with, so there's something special there. Now, there's a couple ways you can handle the upgrading. You can do it the way I did it, where I picked a role-specific location to put things. For instance, in the Catacombs with the Seance Ring, I also put the Crest Shield, so you discovered it as part of the roleplay. Similarly, the Astora Straight Sword I got by defeating Oscar. It was a kind of master using it, and then you could have it kind of thing. So you can do it that way, which is fun, but you'll have to be, kind of honest with how you set it up. Or you can do it by reaching a certain upgrade threshold. So you could have the East-West Shield needs to reach +5 before you can get the Heater Shield, and then it will just naturally evolve into that. And then it's up to you if you need to spend the soul items to upgrade the Heater Shield once again to +5, or if by getting your East-West Shield to +5, it automatically becomes a +5 Heater Shield. That's up to you. The last way I see you doing this is by reaching a certain level threshold, and then just having each item available for you to choose at certain thresholds. So what you could do is, let's say you reach level 25, and then you get the choice to upgrade either your sword, your shield, or your armor. You could include catalysts and rings in this as well, but it's just a lot more math, and that makes it far more tedious than it needs to be, I think. The main purpose of using this rule in the first place is I wanted to keep my character really stable throughout, but I didn't want it to be completely identical. I wanted to change and acquire new weapons and new armor, but I wanted to be very negligible improvements. And the reason for that is Dark Souls is full of different armor sets and weapons that it just stands to reason that a player would invariably pick something new up along the way to build their character, even if it's their first playthrough. And in so doing, I was creating something of a similar experience to my first playthrough, but it wasn't overpowering myself, or at least that was the intent. I didn't want to give myself anything too strong, and I definitely went overboard by giving myself the Silver Knight Straight Sword. So be cutthroat about it. Make sure you start with the short sword, and then that becomes like the long sword, and then that can become maybe the Balder Side Sword. So you get something good in the end, but it's not like the Silver Knight Straight Sword, and it's not like, Ricard's Rapier or something like that. To be honest, I don't actually know if Ricard's Rapier is any good, as I've never used it, but it looks pretty lethal with its special attack. Anyways, that's all I have to say in terms of the playthrough. It was fun. I definitely recommend it. In the future, I have a couple more characters I'd like to do as well. Like, I want to do a build that's very melee-based, a build that's strictly sorceries, and then I want to do a build that's knightly, so they're going to wear heavy armor, and I'll have to go through the whole game in super, super heavy armor. And so I might try to do those as Let's Plays in the future, and I would probably follow most of these rules to a T. I might bend them a little bit depending on the character I'm playing. And if I do that, I'm not going to be evaluating the difficulty so much as just having fun and grading and getting, an even deeper understanding of the game and all the different builds variety that it comes with. Anyways, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're curious to hear more of my thoughts about Dark Souls, the series, its more artistic elements, then I highly recommend you check out my intimate look at Dark Souls. That's on my channel as well. I'll post it after this one. And in the future, I think I'm mostly going to be doing intimate looks. So in either case, let me know what content is interesting to you. If you like this kind of video, or if you like something more like the intimate looks, leave a comment or something like that, just so I have an idea, so I know what idea is sticking with people and what isn't. Anyways, have a good one. I'll see you next time.